"I'd like to make a toast," Vincent announced, raising his crystal champagne flute with practiced elegance. The crowd of well-dressed guests in his expansive living room turned to face him, conversations fading to attentive silence. His eyes gleamed with that familiar excitement I'd seen countless times since childhood, the look that always appeared when he was about to command everyone's attention. To new beginnings, new homes, and... He paused dramatically, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing momentarily on me, to Grandpa Walter's memory. A respectful hush fell over the gathering. Our grandfather had passed away just 4 days ago, and the loss still felt raw, an open wound that hadn't even begun to heal. I raised my glass alongside everyone else, my throat tight with emotion as I silently honored the man who had shaped so much of who I'd become. The amber liquid in my glass caught the light from the chandelier overhead, reminding me of how sunlight filtered through the old windows of Grandpa's lakeside cabin on summer afternoons. "Speaking of Grandpa Walter," Vincent continued, setting his drink down on the marble-topped coffee table with a soft clink, "I have an announcement to make." My stomach tensed as I watched him reach into the breast pocket of his tailored suit and extract an envelope, its edges slightly worn. The confidence in his movements made my skin prickle with unease. Vincent's eyes flicked toward me for just a moment, long enough for me to catch something calculating in his expression. "Before he died, Grandpa gave me this letter," Vincent announced, his voice projecting effortlessly across the high-ceilinged room of his new suburban estate. "He wanted me to have his historic lakeside property, including plans for developing the surrounding area into what he called the Mitchell Heritage District." The room erupted in surprised murmurs and enthusiastic congratulations. My father, Daniel, nodded with obvious pride, while my mother, Margaret, immediately began discussing the historical significance of the area with the guests nearest to her. Vincent's fiancée, Gabriella, clapped her hands in delight, already talking about restoration opportunities with animated gestures. Across the room, my best friend Naomi shot me a bewildered look, her journalist's instincts clearly triggered. She, more than anyone else here, knew how deeply connected Grandpa Walter and I had been through our shared passion for historical preservation. I sat frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. The lakeside property wasn't just any vacation home, it was a historically significant 19th-century cabin that Grandpa Walter had lovingly restored and protected. It was where I'd spent nearly every weekend for the past 3 years, helping him document the architecture, cataloging artifacts, and recording his stories about the region's history. Those conversations had inspired my doctoral thesis and eventually my career path. Vincent, with his real estate development business, had visited perhaps twice in the last 5 years, always complaining about the primitive conditions and lack of modern amenities. But more importantly, Grandpa Walter had entrusted me with a weathered wooden archival box 3 weeks ago, making me promise not to open it until the historical record needed to be set straight, as he'd put it. Inside was a notarized deed transferring ownership of the property to me, along with documentation for its historic designation application. He had already legally given me the property, it wasn't even part of his estate. As Vincent unfolded the letter and began reciting what were supposedly Grandpa's wishes for commercial development of the property, I studied his face intently. The confident smile, the theatrical hand gestures, was he lying? Did he somehow know about the deed? Had Grandpa Walter changed his mind without telling me? "That's wonderful, Vincent. Congratulations," I managed to say with a forced smile that felt brittle on my face, even as my pulse raced with confusion and growing anger. "If you'll excuse me, I need to step away for a moment. I needed to get to my office at the university and check the documents in that archival box immediately." I quietly excused myself, murmuring something about needing to use the restroom, and slipped away from the crowd now buzzing with excited conversation about Vincent's development plans. As I closed the bathroom door behind me, I leaned heavily against it and tried to steady my breathing. The letter Vincent had displayed made no sense. Grandpa Walter's handwriting had grown increasingly shaky in his final months due to severe arthritis, a fact I knew intimately from helping him document his architectural drawings. But the signature I'd glimpsed looked suspiciously smooth and confident, nothing like the painstaking script I'd watched him struggle with. My phone vibrated with a text from Naomi. "You okay?" That announcement was bizarre. Vincent never showed any interest in historical preservation. And wasn't that property already part of your joint conservation project? I quickly texted back, "Need to check some documents at my office. Can you make excuses for me? Say the department called with an emergency?" Within minutes, Naomi had smoothly covered for my departure, and I slipped out through the kitchen and side door while the guests continued to congratulate Vincent on his inheritance and ambitious development plans. The drive to my small house in the university's historic district felt dreamlike, my thoughts swirling with confusion. Street lamps blurred past as memories of Grandpa Walter flooded my mind, his patient explanations of architectural details as we documented the cabin's unique construction methods, his excitement when we discovered original survey maps in the county archives, his laughter when I'd tried to use period tools to repair a section of weathered siding. The lakeside property wasn't just real estate, it was a living museum of regional history and our family's connection to it. It was our special place, where Grandpa Walter had taught me about the importance of preserving the past while building thoughtfully toward the future. Vincent had never shown any interest in those values or the property's historical significance. His announcement felt like a violation of everything Grandpa Walter had stood for and everything we had worked to protect. Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading the letter, Grandpa Walter's distinctive handwriting growing more unsteady toward the end of the page. "I know your brother might contest this designation and transfer of ownership, which is why I've had everything properly notarized and filed with the Historical Preservation Commission. Attorney Harold Thompson has all the documentation, including the conservation easement paperwork. The property is legally yours already, Eliza. This isn't part of my will or estate. I trust you to honor our vision for preserving this historic site and the stories it holds." I sat back in my office chair, stunned by the audacity of what Vincent had done. He'd fabricated documents knowing full well that Grandpa Walter had already transferred the lakeside property to me with specific preservation intentions. Even for Vincent, with his reputation for aggressive business tactics, this level of deception within our own family was breathtaking. My phone vibrated repeatedly with messages. My parents wanted to know where I'd disappeared to. Vincent had texted as well, "Nice exit strategy, Professor. Don't worry, you can still study the historic buildings if you ask permission. Maybe we'll name a plaque after you in the visitor center." That condescending message crystallized what I needed to do. I wouldn't confront him electronically or over the phone. This situation demanded a direct, face-to-face conversation with evidence in hand. I carefully gathered the documents, including the historic designation application we'd been working on, and placed everything back into Grandpa's archival box. According to the time, Vincent's event would continue for several more hours. I wiped my eyes, took a steadying breath, and headed back to my car with renewed determination. It was time for historical accuracy to be established. The drive to Vincent's new development gave me time to compose my thoughts. I had no intention of creating a dramatic scene. That wasn't my approach to conflict, and certainly not what Grandpa Walter would have advised. During our documentation projects, he'd often told me, "When primary sources support your position, Eliza, you never need theatrical presentations." The documented truth carries more weight than any elaborate fabrication. I parked a street away from Vincent's house, the wooden archival box secure on the passenger seat beside me. For several minutes, I remained there, gathering my courage and resolve. I thought about all the weekends spent with Grandpa Walter at the lakeside property, cataloging architectural details, interviewing elderly residents about the area's history, and recording his own memories of the region's development. I remembered his excitement when we'd secured preliminary approval for the historic designation, and how we'd celebrated on the wide porch overlooking the water, planning a small museum installation for the boathouse. "What approach would you take, Grandpa?" I whispered, running my fingers over the smooth, age-darkened wood of the box. The answer materialized in my mind with his characteristic clarity: present the facts with dignity and purpose. Rather than returning directly to the party, I texted Naomi first, "How many people remain at the event?" She responded promptly, "Just family and close associates now. Most industry people and press have departed. Are you returning?" This timing was ideal. I preferred to address this situation without an audience of business associates and reporters. I took the box and walked purposefully to Vincent's front entrance. When I rang the bell, Vincent himself answered, his expression shifting from surprise to defensive irritation. "Department emergency resolved already?" he asked, his tone making it clear he recognized my earlier excuse for the fiction it was. "We need to discuss something important, Vincent," I said with professional composure, stepping past him into the house. All eyes turned as I entered the expansive living room. My father was studying what appeared to be Vincent's development proposals, while my mother was engaged in conversation with Gabriella about potential interior design concepts for the lakeside property. Naomi sat observing from a corner armchair, her journalist's notebook discreetly open on her lap. "Eliza has returned," my mother announced unnecessarily. "We were just discussing Vincent's exciting plans for the Mitchell Heritage District." "Actually," I said, placing the archival box deliberately on the glass coffee table, "that's precisely what I need to address." Vincent's gaze fixed on the box, recognition and alarm flashing across his features. "What's that?" he asked, though his expression revealed he already suspected the answer. "Historical documentation that Grandpa Walter entrusted to me 3 weeks ago," I explained evenly, maintaining my professional demeanor. "He specifically instructed me not to open it until historical accuracy needed to be established." That moment has arrived. Before Vincent could interject, my father leaned forward with scholarly interest. "What exactly did you find, Eliza?" I opened the box and carefully removed the notarized deed and accompanying historical designation application. 6 months ago, Grandpa Walter legally transferred ownership of the lakeside property to me, I explained, placing the documents on the table where everyone could examine them. "It's already registered in my name with a conservation easement attached. The property isn't part of his estate or will, and it's in the final stages of receiving historic landmark status, which would prevent any significant development." A weighted silence descended on the room. My mother's expression registered shock, while my father picked up the deed, examining it with the careful attention of an academic. Vincent remained motionless, the color visibly draining from his face. "This is properly notarized," my father confirmed, adjusting his reading glasses as he scrutinized the document. "And I recognize Walter's signature. Notice the characteristic angle of the W he always used." "That's not possible," Vincent finally responded, his confident facade cracking. "Grandpa gave me authorization documents for the development. He wanted me to revitalize the area." "May I see those documents again?" I asked, extending my hand toward my father. He passed Vincent's papers to me, and I placed them alongside Grandpa Walter's authentic letter from the archival box. The differences were immediately apparent and unmistakable. The handwriting on Vincent's documents was a reasonable imitation but lacked the distinctive tremor caused by Grandpa's arthritis. The signature appeared too perfect, too controlled, without the hesitations evident in his genuine script. "Vincent," my mother said quietly, her museum curator's training evident in her careful examination of both documents, "did you fabricate these development authorizations?" His continued silence confirmed what we all now realized. Vincent's uncomfortable silence stretched for several moments before he finally spoke, his voice carrying a mixture of defiance and desperation. "You don't understand the market opportunity here. It's completely unreasonable that she gets control of historically significant property that could benefit the entire region economically. What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, genuinely perplexed by his perspective. "You were always Grandpa's intellectual heir," Vincent said, words rushing out with years of pent-up resentment. "Always documenting everything, always discussing preservation theories, always the perfect academic granddaughter. The rest of us never had a chance to contribute our expertise or vision." My father cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Vincent, regardless of your feelings about property utilization, falsifying your grandfather's authorization is a serious ethical breach, possibly with legal implications." "Let me examine those more carefully," my mother interjected, reaching for both sets of documents. She compared them side by side, her trained curator's eye confirming what we already suspected. "Oh, Vincent," she sighed, disappointment evident in her voice. "How could you misrepresent Walter's intentions this way?" Gabriella rose slowly from her seat, her expression stricken. "I should give your family some privacy to discuss this," she murmured, avoiding Vincent's imploring look as she gathered her portfolio of design concepts and moved toward the door. "Gabriella, wait, I can explain the development opportunity." Vincent called after her, but she had already departed, the heavy front door closing with finality behind her. The room fell into uncomfortable silence again. Naomi caught my eye from across the room and gave me a supportive nod. As a journalist covering historical preservation issues, she had always recognized Vincent's dismissive attitude toward cultural heritage, even when my parents seemed blind to it. "I simply cannot comprehend this," my father said at last, turning to Vincent with the disappointed expression he typically reserved for students caught plagiarizing. "Why would you announce development plans without verifying your legal standing? The formal reading of the will isn't scheduled until next week." Vincent's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "I discovered information about the property transfer," he admitted reluctantly. "I was meeting with Grandpa's attorney last week regarding the estate distribution, and Thompson mentioned that the lakeside property wasn't included because alternative arrangements had been finalized. He refused to provide details due to confidentiality obligations, but I understood what it implied. I believed if I announced my development vision first, perhaps. Maybe what?" my mother pressed, her curator's training evident in her determination to catalog every detail of the situation. "Maybe Eliza would exchange the property for investment capital? Maybe the family would see the economic logic of my vision instead of her academic perspective," Vincent snapped, his composed business demeanor cracking as his voice rose. "Maybe I could contribute something meaningful to Grandpa's legacy too." His words hung in the air, revealing a jealousy far deeper than I had realized existed between us. Despite my anger, I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Had he genuinely felt so excluded from Grandpa Walter's intellectual world? "Vincent," I said quietly, "Grandpa invited you to participate in the Preservation Committee meetings dozens of times. You always claimed you were too occupied with development projects." Because I felt like an outsider in your academic circle, he retorted, pacing now. By the time I recognized the significance of what you two were documenting, the parameters were already established. You shared your specialized vocabulary, your preservation theories, your historical references. There was no space for a different perspective on utilizing those assets. My father shook his head, the disappointment of a lifetime educator evident in his expression. That cannot possibly justify fabricating documents and misleading the entire family about Walter's intentions. Vincent dropped heavily into a leather armchair, the entrepreneurial energy that typically animated him suddenly depleted. What's the next step then? He asked, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. You've established your historical accuracy, Eliza. Your academic rigor wins again. This isn't about winning some academic debate, I responded, thinking of Grandpa Walter and how he would handle this moment. Despite Vincent's deception, he remained my brother, and I knew our grandfather had valued Vincent's drive and vision, even while disagreeing with his methods. I reached once more into the archival box and withdrew something I hadn't previously mentioned, a sealed business envelope with Vincent's name written on it in Grandpa Walter's distinctive architectural lettering. He prepared something specifically for you as well, I said, extending it toward my brother. Vincent looked up, skepticism and cautious hope battling across his features. What is it? I haven't opened it, I admitted truthfully. Grandpa Walter was explicit that I should respect the privacy of any documentation not addressed directly to me. After a moment of hesitation, Vincent accepted the envelope and carefully broke the seal. As he read the contents, his expression transformed from defensive to astonished, finally settling into what appeared to be genuine contrition. He anticipated this, Vincent said finally, his voice barely audible. He predicted I might try to develop the lakeside property. My mother moved to sit beside him. What does Walter say in the letter, Vincent? Vincent paused, then handed her the document. Everyone should hear this, he said, his business confidence nowhere in evidence. My mother retrieved her reading glasses from her purse and began, Dear Vincent, if you're reading this letter, then Eliza has accessed my archival materials, which indicates one of two possibilities: either I've passed away, or circumstances have necessitated the disclosure of these documents sooner than expected. I've observed your development as a businessman since you were a determined young man selling handmade crafts at community markets, and I understand your entrepreneurial spirit. You've always sought recognition for your business acumen and vision, elements I perhaps failed to acknowledge adequately. However, I've also noticed that when you feel your expertise is undervalued, you sometimes make expedient decisions that compromise others' trust and ultimately undermine your own credibility. The lakeside property has been legally transferred to Eliza with conservation easements. This decision was made after considerable reflection and professional consultation, not because I valued your talents less, but because Eliza's connection to the historical significance of the property aligns with my preservation goals. She comprehends why this architectural record matters to our regional heritage, and I'm confident she'll maintain its historical integrity. What you require isn't another development property, Vincent, but a purposeful application of your business expertise. I've arranged for seed funding of $25,000 to be transferred to you. Apply it toward establishing something meaningful that harmonizes with preservation values. Perhaps consider the heritage tourism concept you mentioned during last Thanksgiving's dinner, or explore another venture that balances economic opportunity with cultural stewardship. I hope with time you'll recognize that this isn't about academic favorites or commercial fairness. It's about aligning the right steward with the right responsibility. Eliza will welcome your business perspective regarding the property's sustainable future, I'm certain, but your greatest contribution lies in building enterprises that respect historical context while creating economic value. With respect for your abilities, Walter Mitchell. When my mother finished reading, the room was completely silent. Vincent sat motionless, the check resting in his hand, his usual confidence temporarily abandoned. He understood my motivations completely, he murmured, even while disagreeing with my methods. My father moved to place a supportive hand on Vincent's shoulder. Your grandfather was remarkably perceptive about people's core drives. Vincent looked directly at me, perhaps genuinely seeing me as a colleague rather than a competitor for the first time in years. I apologize, Eliza. I had no right to misrepresent Grandpa's intentions for a property he had already legally entrusted to your care. The admission clearly cost him professionally, but sounded authentic nonetheless. I nodded, acknowledging his apology while not quite ready to offer complete reconciliation after such a significant breach of trust. There's additional documentation in the box, I said, reaching for it once more. I extracted a carefully preserved photo album and opened it to reveal images spanning decades. Vincent and me as children at the lakeside property, examining architectural details, helping Grandpa Walter document historic buildings in the surrounding area. He maintained this visual record in the antique desk at the cabin, I explained, turning pages to reveal more recent documentation. He consistently hoped you would eventually recognize the value in preservation alongside development. Vincent studied the photographs, genuine emotion replacing his business persona. I fundamentally misunderstood the situation, didn't I? Yes, I confirmed, not softening the reality, but Grandpa Walter clearly believed in your capacity to evolve your perspective. The room grew quiet again, but it was a different quality of silence, reflective rather than confrontational, melancholy rather than hostile. Naomi, who had been observing the entire exchange with a journalist's careful attention, finally spoke. What direction do things take from here? The question articulated what everyone was considering. How does a family progress after such a significant revelation? What path forward exists after deception and its painful acknowledgement? I closed the archival box carefully, feeling the weight of responsibility Grandpa Walter had entrusted to me, not just for the historic property, but perhaps for rebuilding our family relationships as well. Going forward, I said quietly, we should focus on honoring what Grandpa Walter envisioned for both of us. The gathering dispersed shortly afterward. My parents departed with worried glances toward Vincent, visibly torn between disappointment in his ethical lapse and concern for his professional reputation. Naomi gave me a supportive embrace before leaving, whispering, "I'll call you tomorrow to check in." And then Vincent and I remained alone in his expansive new home, the earlier celebratory atmosphere completely dissolved. Vincent moved through his designer kitchen with uncharacteristic awkwardness, preparing coffee neither of us particularly wanted. The silence between us felt laden with decades of competition and mutual misunderstanding. The fabrication wasn't premeditated, he said finally, placing an artisanal ceramic mug before me. When I discovered the property transfer, I was furious and hurt. I created those documents that same evening, without any real intention to present them publicly. Then what prompted you to use them tonight? I asked, wrapping my hands around the warm mug and studying my brother's face. Vincent stared into his coffee as if searching for strategic insights. When everyone gathered here this evening to celebrate my latest acquisition, I wanted something more significant to announce. Something historic and meaningful. He looked up, his polished business veneer momentarily replaced by genuine vulnerability. I've always envied your intellectual connection with Grandpa Walter. That connection was available to you as well, I observed, keeping my tone professional rather than accusatory. He repeatedly invited your participation in the preservation projects. I recognize that now, Vincent acknowledged, but my pride and focus on immediate development opportunities prevented me from appreciating the value then. He hesitated before asking, "What are your intentions for the lakeside property?" It was the question I'd been considering since Grandpa Walter had transferred ownership to me 6 months earlier. Maintain its historical integrity while making it accessible for educational purposes. It needs conservation work, but I'm committed to preserving its architectural character and cultural significance. Vincent nodded, appearing genuinely relieved. That's appropriate. It should remain as Grandpa Walter envisioned it. I studied my brother, this person with whom I shared a lifetime of history but whose values often seemed completely foreign to my own. Your business expertise would be welcome in developing a sustainable management plan for the site, you know. When you're ready. His eyes widened slightly with surprise. Even after this evening's events? The lakeside property was intended to preserve family history, not fracture family relationships, I said, expressing what I believed Grandpa Walter would have advocated. That doesn't mean I'm not still angry, or that I don't need time to rebuild trust, but the opportunity for collaboration exists. Vincent seemed to recognize the conditional olive branch for what it represented. I appreciate that professional courtesy. We sat in silence for several more minutes, drinking coffee that had grown cold. The evening had been emotionally and intellectually exhausting, and much remained to be processed. I should leave, I said at last, standing to gather my materials. It's been a particularly challenging day. Vincent accompanied me to the door. Before I departed, he asked, "Do you think Grandpa Walter anticipated this conflict over the property's future?" I considered the meticulous preparation evident in Grandpa's documentation, the notarized transfer paperwork, the individually addressed letters, his specific instructions about when to open the archival box. I believe he hoped it wouldn't be necessary, I answered candidly, but he prudently prepared contingency documentation. Vincent shook his head, a rueful smile appearing. Always the strategic thinker, planning 3 steps ahead of everyone else. That was his particular genius, I agreed. As I drove home with the archival box secured beside me once more, I experienced an unusual mixture of emotions: regret for the evening's painful confrontation, professional satisfaction that historical accuracy had prevailed, and cautious optimism that perhaps this could represent a turning point in my relationship with Vincent. The old brass key to the lakeside property felt substantial in my pocket, not merely metal, but the tangible weight of historical stewardship that Grandpa Walter had entrusted to me, a responsibility I intended to honor fully. Yet perhaps there might be space for Vincent's perspective too, if he were willing to approach preservation with genuine respect. Tomorrow, I decided, I would visit the historic property, sit on the wide porch with its original balusters, observe the light changing across the water, and perhaps sense Grandpa Walter's guiding presence once more, helping us navigate toward reconciliation, even in his physical absence. The historic lakeside property appeared exactly as I remembered: weathered cedar shingles with their original patina, hunter green shutters with authentic 19th century hardware, and the architecturally significant wraparound porch that extended along 3 sides of the structure. As I navigated the gravel driveway, morning sunlight filtered through century-old pines, casting intricate patterns across the ground that seemed to welcome me back to this historic site. I remained in my car momentarily, absorbing the scene. This property was now officially under my stewardship, not merely a structure or real estate, but a living repository of regional history and personal memories. I could almost visualize Grandpa Walter in his favorite Adirondack chair, architect's sketchbook open on his lap, as he documented the building's unique structural elements in the afternoon light. The antique brass key turned in the lock with its characteristic resistance. The mechanism required a specific technique, a quirk Grandpa Walter had refused to modernize because, as he often explained, original hardware tells us how people actually lived with these buildings. Inside, everything remained precisely as he had left it. Architectural journals stacked methodically on the side table, surveying equipment organized in the study corner, the subtle aroma of his pipe tobacco lingering despite his doctor's repeated warnings about its effects on the preserved woodwork. I moved carefully through the rooms, my fingers lightly tracing the original millwork that had witnessed generations of our family's history. The stillness felt respectful rather than abandoned, as if the structure itself were patiently waiting to see how its story would continue. My phone vibrated with a message from Naomi. "How's the historic property?" "Your mother called this morning. Vincent appears to be experiencing a professional crisis of confidence." I responded, "The property's architectural integrity remains perfect." Still processing how to approach Vincent's situation. Naomi replied quickly, "He's been contacting various associates, attempting to explain his actions. Your parents remain significantly concerned about potential repercussions." I wasn't surprised. The consequences of last night's revelations would require time to resolve completely. Professional trust, once compromised, couldn't be immediately restored. Setting my phone aside, I approached the original bay window overlooking the lake. The water reflected morning light with timeless tranquility, serene and constant despite the human complications unfolding around it. "I'm here, Grandpa Walter," I whispered to the historic space. "I'll ensure this architectural heritage is properly preserved, just as we discussed." 3 weeks passed before Vincent initiated contact. His message was direct and professional. Would it be possible to discuss potential collaboration? At the lakeside property, perhaps? I considered for a full day before proposing a specific time and date. Part of me remained hesitant to share this historically significant space with him so soon, but Grandpa Walter's philosophy kept returning to mind. Historical preservation without reconciliation creates museums without meaning, Eliza. Sometimes accepting change benefits the preserver more than the preserved. When Vincent's car arrived the following Saturday, I was seated on the historic porch swing, reviewing preservation guidelines while enjoying morning coffee. He approached with uncharacteristic hesitation, appearing more subdued than I had observed in years. "The architectural integrity remains perfectly maintained," he observed, studying the structure's details. "That's our primary objective," I responded, indicating the period-appropriate chair across from me. He sat down, fingers tapping restlessly against his knees. "I've been drafting potential approaches to this conversation for weeks, but everything seems insufficient." "Present your perspective anyway," I suggested, maintaining professional neutrality. Vincent took a measured breath. "I apologize sincerely. Not merely for the document fabrication, but for everything preceding it. For resenting your academic connection with Grandpa Walter. For undermining your preservation work when I should have been examining my own developmental philosophy." I studied his expression, attempting to evaluate the authenticity behind his words. The Vincent I knew professionally had always been skilled at presenting whatever narrative benefited his business objectives. "What was your actual motivation?" I asked directly. "I need the unvarnished truth, Vincent." He gazed out across the lake, remaining silent for a considerable moment. I calculated that if I controlled the property, it would somehow compensate for all the preservation opportunities one neglected here, as if I could retroactively purchase those missed experiences. His professionally composed voice faltered slightly. "Completely irrational from a business perspective, isn't it?" There was an authenticity in his admission that felt genuine, not a strategic explanation, but rather a somber recognition of flawed reasoning. "I've invested the seed funding," he announced unexpectedly. "Grandpa Walter's financial contribution, for whatever it demonstrates. I've registered for that architectural preservation workshop he consistently recommended, the one I always claimed was incompatible with my development schedule. He offered a rare self-deprecating smile. It appears I have minimal natural talent for hand restoration techniques, but I'm committed to completing the certification. His assessment was accurate. There's something centering about focusing on preserving historical elements with your own hands. It was a modest beginning, but remarkably significant coming from Vincent, who had consistently prioritized efficiency and modernization over craftsmanship and tradition. He would have genuinely appreciated that commitment, I said quietly. We sat together in companionable silence, absorbing the gentle rhythmic sounds of water against the historic boathouse and the distant calls of native birds. It was the same natural acoustic environment that had accompanied countless historical documentation sessions between Grandpa Walter and me throughout the years. There's something historically significant I believe you should examine, I said finally, rising from my seat. Vincent followed me inside to Grandpa Walter's study, where the authentic Victorian roll-top desk occupied its original position in the eastern corner, illuminated by morning light filtering through the wavy glass of the original windows. I used the brass key from the archival box to unlock the desk's mechanism, revealing meticulously organized compartments containing correspondence, academic papers, and carefully preserved artifacts. Grandpa Walter maintained comprehensive documentation, I explained, retrieving a folder labeled Vincent Mitchell. Inside were preserved newspaper articles about Vincent's collegiate business competition victories, professional photographs from his MBA graduation ceremony, and even a carefully annotated printout of the Business Journal article announcing his development company's formation. He respected your professional accomplishments, I said honestly. He simply expressed his pride through documentation rather than the public recognition you preferred. Vincent's typically steady hands trembled visibly as he carefully examined the collection. I never realized he maintained such detailed records of my professional development. He created an archival folder for each family member, I explained. He referred to it as his legacy documentation project. Vincent looked up, unexpected emotion visible in his eyes. I fundamentally misinterpreted the entire situation, didn't I? Yes, I confirmed, maintaining historical accuracy, but Grandpa Walter clearly believed in professional evolution. As do I. I retrieved a conservation planning calendar from my research materials and presented it to him. I've scheduled several weekends dedicated to preservation assessments and conservation projects. Your business perspective would be valuable, even if your restoration techniques require refinement. A genuine smile appeared briefly. You're serious about collaboration? This historic property was intended to preserve our shared heritage, not exacerbate family divisions, I stated. That represents Grandpa Walter's fundamental vision. Later that afternoon, we sat on the rehabilitated dock, feet suspended above the clear water. Vincent outlined potential sustainable tourism concepts for the boathouse while I sketched possible adaptive reuse approaches in my documentation notebook. You understand, Vincent observed, gazing across the historically significant landscape. I believe Grandpa Walter made a completely rational decision in appointing you as steward for this property. How so? I asked. You didn't merely inherit a historic structure, he reflected thoughtfully. You inherited his responsibility for preserving what truly matters across generations. As the sun descended behind the western mountains, casting golden reflections across the protected waters, I realized Grandpa Walter had entrusted me with something far more significant than property rights. He'd provided the opportunity to repair fractured relationships and establish new collaborative approaches, beginning with the brother whose professional values had nearly created a permanent division between us.